again. Isn't this place just beautiful and peaceful? Love to come here just to relax. And it's an appropriate place to talk about one last thing concerning Revelation. We talked about the four forms of revelation, but there are many people who say, yes, but aren't these two books the final revelation? Aren't they the two final revelations for both Christianity over here and the Qur'an here? I don't think it's that helpful because of the claims that Muslims make about their final revelation. See, this book here is their final revelation. This is their eternal revelation. This is the one that they believe has never been created, coexistence with God eternally. It was sent down to a man named Muhammad over a 22-year period, and then was finally written down during the time of about 652 when Uthman had Zayd ibn Thabit write it down, and then for the last 1400 years it has been changed, accreted, deleted, you name it. In fact, it was then finally canonized in its final form, in the form that we see here in 1924, 95 years ago, and then made official as the Quran for the whole world in 1985, we're talking about 35 years ago, so roughly 35 years ago. So can you see the problem? When you look at this book here, this is their primary revelation. This is all they've got. Everything they're dependent on is this as their final credible authority. This, however, is not our primary revelation. Do not compare these two. And I know it's difficult to get away from that because we do that all the time. Even I do that. I do a comparison all the time between these two. But when we're talking about primary revelation, remember we're talking about the whole context of revelation, this is not our primary revelation. It's nothing more than a book. Our primary revelation is what this book points to, what it refers to, or who it points to, who it refers to. It's not a book, but a man. So our primary revelation is Jesus Christ. This entire book all points to Jesus Christ. So how and what would we find as parallels for this book? Not this book, not parallel. If you want to find a parallel, let me help you. Let me see if this works. Instead, take a look at the New Testament. When you look at the New Testament, which is the second part of the book, not the second half, but the second part, there are four genres in there that parallel what Muslims use to understand the Quran, because the Quran is very difficult to understand. It's not a book that's easy to apply, as we are going to find out as we go on and on through these episodes. So what do Muslims do? Well, they don't go to the Quran to know how to live day to day, because there's very little about it that really is relevant for today. It's relevant for the 7th century, and it's relevant for Muhammad, but it's not really relevant for you and me and those of us living around the world. So Muslims have to go elsewhere. They have to go outside, and they go to four genres of what they know as Islamic traditions. And the Islamic traditions, the first and the earliest of these Islamic traditions is known as the Sirah. The Sirah to Rasulullah, which would be the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. It is his biography that we go to find out what he did, to know then what Muslims are to do today. So what is the Sirah of Jesus? Well, the Sirah of Jesus is very clear. It is what we would call the Gospels of Jesus Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but written in the black letter. The black lettered part of the Gospels of Jesus Christ would be the Sirah of Jesus, not Muhammad, which I almost got that wrong because I'm so used to using the two together. So the Sirah of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the black letter part of it. Now the second genre that the Muslims have is what they know as the Hadith. Those were revealed by Sahih Bukhari, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, those other ones. Those are all those as the sayings of Muhammad. The sayings of Jesus would be, again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it would be the red letter part, where he actually spoke. And not in this Bible, but in many Bibles, you do have that red letter. And that would be the Hadith of Jesus. So the Hadith of Jesus would be the red letter. The Sirah of Jesus would be the black letter of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the Tafsir, which are the commentaries that unpack the Qur'an, that unpack this book, that show you how you are to apply this book. And the Tafsir are first created by men like Al-Tabari, then there's Badawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, all these others. There's a whole myriad of Tafsir writers, compilers. They begin in the 10th century, 923 and onwards. What would be the Tafsir of Jesus? Well, the tafsir would be the commentaries that help explain the gospel of Jesus, and those would be the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul to Ephesus, to Corinth, to Philippi. These are the tafsir. These are the way, this is what Paul does. He takes what Jesus says and takes what Jesus does, and then he applies it to Philippi, Ephesus, Corinth, city by city by city. And that's why it changes depending on what the needs are for each of those cities. And that's why it makes it so relevant for today, because we can take those ideas, those examples, and we can then contextualize it for every day and for every place and everywhere, every time. So that would be the tafsir of Jesus' teaching, would be Paul's letters. And then we have the last genre, the fourth one, which would be the tahriq. The tahriq would be the histories of all mankind up until the time of Muhammad. And the tahriq were first also compiled by a man named Al-Tabari, the same one who compiled the first tafsir. And those tahriq would be the equivalent or the parallel in the New Testament with the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church. So there you have the Sirah of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the black letter part. You have the Hadith of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the red letter part of those Gospels. You have the Tafsir of Jesus, which would be the letters of Paul. And then you have the Tariq, or the histories of the early church in the book of Acts. So really then, the Bible, the New Testament especially, the parallel for it would be, of course, the traditions, the four traditions, Sirah, Hadith, Tafsir, and Tahriq for the Muslims. All of which don't even begin to appear for the Muslims. They don't even begin to appear until 200 years after Muhammad. Whereas the Sirah, the Hadith, and the Tafsir of Jesus begin to appear within 17 years of his death with Paul's letters. Carmen Christi, the Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 11. That is one of the earliest references, and was written within 3, some say within 7, maybe even 8 or 9 years after Christ's death. So within within 30s AD. And all of the Sirah, the Tafsir, the Hadith, and the Tahriq of Jesus would have been written within the first century, written by those who actually knew him, like John and Matthew, and those who heard it from others that knew him, like Mark and like Luke. Paul, who also would have written down what others had said and what the Holy Spirit told him. Now, it's fascinating then when you look at this book and you compare it with the traditions. This is by far more authoritative because it's so much closer and is written by the eyewitnesses, or those who knew Jesus, who got it from the eyewitnesses. Whereas when you look at the traditions of Muhammad, they come hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. Boy, I'd rather go with this book. But still, this is not our primary revelation. This just speaks and points to a man. It's Jesus himself who is the one that should be comparing this book to. See, this book, Muslims believe, was never created. Well, Jesus was never created. This book, they believe, is eternal. Jesus is eternal. This book, they believe, was sent down to a man named Muhammad over a 22-year period. Jesus was sent down by God the Father to the earth, to us. This book, they believe, was complete. They say at the time of Uthman, we know that it was only complete at the time in 1924. And this book, they say, was unchanged. Well, we know it's been thousands of changing. Jesus has always been complete, and Jesus has never changed. So when you do comparison with comparison, everything they claim for this book, eternal, sent down, complete, and unchanged, works for Jesus, doesn't work for this book. So we've got a much greater revelation, primary revelation, much more authoritative, more credible, much more relevant, as we're going to find out as we go through these episodes and unpack this book. Because the more you read this book, the more you find how irrelevant it is. The more you look at Jesus, the more you study him, the more you look at what he said, the more you look at what he did, the more that you try to apply him to today and every day, to here and everywhere, the more relevant he becomes. Oh, our primary revelation is so much bigger and better than what Islam has. I'm so glad that I don't have to compare these two books. All I need to do is compare Jesus, the man behind this book, with this book. And there's no comparison. Come on home, folks. Can you see? The more we unpack this, the more we look at it, the more we find problems with it. The more you look at Jesus, the more you unpack him, the more you look at him in the pages of this book, the more relevant he is. I can't find anything wrong with Jesus. In almost 40 years of working with Muslims, I've asked this question. Tell me one thing that's wrong with him, and they can't find it. You can't find it either. What a man. What a revelation. What a beautiful model and paradigm for today and any day. Come on back to him. God bless you. On such a peaceful day in front of us, such a peaceful street. This is Jay.